back. Ended up looking at the time when I was rambling. I love this stuff. You may not find it as interesting as I do, just divulging this information in my head. It's my reviews of these albums, this era of music that I grew up with, the things that I love and the things I love listening to. Of course, being a big Kiss fan, I had to include Kiss in there. But basically, we're going to talk about kind of like the rise of a new rock era, not just grunge in particular, but bands like Guns N' Roses and Skid Row, who had a different breed of rock and roll, heavy metal at that time or whatever. You had Metallica in the 80s that was dubbed the Kings of Thrash. Of course, you also had Slayer and stuff like that who stayed true to the genre. Megadeth, who never really strayed away from that whole marketed idea or campaign of sound that they became and will always probably forever be. Megadeth did put out Risk, but still it's heavy. It has themes in there that are reminiscent of anything else that they've done. But then you have bands like Metallica who did the Black Album and slowed down what they did. And honestly, to me, I think it pays homage to Sabbath era metal. You had Deep Purple and Sabbath and things like that kind of had these early on ideas of heavier rock music than someone like the Beatles or the Stones were doing. But times change, eras change, people change, ideas change, and not everybody wants to sound the same. Because when Kiss was putting music out, they had their original era 4 members: Ace, Peter, Ace, and Paul and Gene. And then now we're all the way to Ace is putting out his solo stuff, and Tommy and Eric have taken over the mantle, and it's a totally different band altogether. But somewhere in there, they took off the makeup, and they had these ballads and these pop hits, and they took off the makeup, but they were wearing more flair and color and weird stuff in the 80s. So by the 90s, they put out Revenge in 92, and they're kind of floating along with Guns N' Roses and bands like that are more hard edge and just straightforward rock. But what I really wanted to cover here today was the albums that, to me, sound more like grunge albums or wannabe grunge albums than your typical, Dr. Feelgood's or even Slave to the Grind or Skid Row's first album. Because, you're talking about an era where you have like Cherry Pie, and I know that came out basically the same time that grunge and the Seattle craze was hitting, but it was a totally different look and a totally different style of rock. These big guitars, big solos, tight leather pants, big hair, frills and lace, and then you have these dudes in t-shirts and jeans ripped up and holy coming up on stage with these crazy rock songs that are just somewhat depressing in some sense. They're more down to earth, and they cover topics that aren't so LA Strip party, and more Seattle. You could imagine it's dark and raining when you're listening to this stuff. So the first one that I like to talk about whenever I talk about this stuff is Motley Crue's self-titled album that came out in 94 with John Corabi. They fired Vince Neil as the singer and got John Corabi. And this is like, honestly, hands down, one of my favorite albums of all times, and one of my favorite Motley Crue albums. I'm a big Motley Crue fan. I love Tommy Lee as a drummer, and I love Nikki Sixx and Mick, and I even like Vince. Not a real big Vince fan. I feel like he let himself go. But I love this album because there's so many different things. There's Misunderstood, Hooligan's Holiday. It's just a mixed bag of rock and roll, and it's just raw. It's just really raw and heavy. It's totally unlike anything that they did in the 80s. Of course, at that time, what rock music was doing was totally not what they were doing. It was basically a referendum on big hair. And, punk had its renaissance with grunge. And of course, you have bands like Skid Row who put out this album. Their self-titled came out in 1990, and and it was more up there with GNR. It was straightforward rock, but they went a step further. Like if you listen to Subhuman Race, songs like Eileen and stuff, Medicine Man or Medicine Jar, excuse me, these songs are not reminiscent of a hair band. They're not, they're just not. They're just totally different. But I even think that, realistically, I think even bands like Kiss did this. I think bands like Kiss did it because once Kurt Cobain had passed, the playing field was leveled in a sense. Like I was talking earlier in part one, it's like this amalgam of a brotherhood of music, and you have all these different players. John Five, who everybody knows was in Marilyn Manson and is in Rob Zombie currently and does his own solo stuff, started out with David Lee Roth. And if you think about that, how that wraps around, David Lee Roth is the party Van Halen, like, typical big 80s, big hair Van Halen. And then you have Ray Luzier, who's in Korn, who started out with him as well. It's just kind of weird because you think that these people are pigeonholed into these certain genres of music, and they're not. Carnival of Souls, it came out in 97? Yeah, Carnival of Souls came out in 97. And it was the lineup of Paul, Gene, of course, never leaving that lineup, and then Bruce and Eric, who were leaving the band because they were putting the makeup back on with Pete and Ace. So even Hot in the Shade and Revenge, man, those albums, Hot in the Shade had a ballad on it. They were riding that wave of, hair bands doing the ballads. It was a big ballad era right before grunge kind of took hold. And I think that's what grunge was doing, was kind of saving rock music from that whole, like, cheesiness of it. And so you have bands like Kiss who did these really good albums that were just straightforward rock, and that's one of them. It's one of my favorite Kiss albums because those guys really know how to play their instruments. Bruce and Eric, and Tommy does too. If you listen to the new stuff that just came out, Monster, Sonic Boom, there's some really good eclectic sounding Kiss songs on there, but they're written really well. And that's not to defame Ace and Peter. I love the Ace and Peter era, and I even love the 80s. Vinny, Eric Carr, Mark St. John, all that stuff. And to me, it's all just a big fun bag of music because I love music, and I love Kiss especially, and hair bands. But one thing, one band that gets a lot of flack is Metallica, because they were a thrash band, talking about thrash earlier, and how Pantera kind of held that together in the 90s, that great metal sound. And they really didn't care what people thought. They were not a grunge band, but they had that no fucks given attitude. We're going to go out there and wear our Kiss t-shirts and, our Slayer t-shirts, and we're going to grow our hair long and our beards long and play music, man. And that's kind of what the whole thing was in the 90s. It was more about the music than the hair. The big hair and, the 15 neck guitars that, Cheap Trick had in the 70s, and kind of building on that and making it kind of just this really weird routine that if your hair was big and you had all these flashy colors, that you were going to get heard, because some of these guys couldn't play to save their life. And I'm not saying the guys that I'm talking about today, but I'm talking about like some of these 80s LA hair bands that really wanted to get famous, that weren't really a band at all. They were just kind of like today's boy bands or these pop groups that come up with these really stupid songs that have a hook and they last 2 minutes and they don't even have an album's worth of material, but they're on the radio. But Metallica, they put out the Black Album. They got a little bit of flack for that. After Cliff died and Jason Newsted joined the band, Injustice was kind of like their last thrash album. And they kind of closed out the decade with that. And then opening the decade was the Black Album. I love that album. I think it's kind of like, for me, like, AC/DC, Aerosmith, and all the classic stuff. It's like Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven. It's not like something that you want to just put on all the time, unless you're just in the mood for it or it's on the album because you're listening to it. it gets old to hear. However, in saying that, the albums that came after that, I'm probably going to get flack myself for liking these albums, but Load and Reload, these are two of my favorite Metallica albums. It's basically a double release, came out in 96, I believe, or 97, yeah. Honestly, it's great stuff because they're great musicians and they're great writers, and it's a shame to have such a cool name, Metallica, and everybody expects them to just stay metal as they branded it, but they're more than thrash. They're metal, and they recognize that. There were other bands that they really liked. I remember watching behind the music back in the day. I just remember one band that they talked about, Husker Du, and I'm like, who is that? I don't know who Husker Du is. Well, Kirk Hammett always talked about it, and I looked at him and I'm like, this is a punk band. You know, it's like sing-songwriter punk band. So they have more to offer than just thrash and metal and stuff like that. I even did that album with Lou Reed, early in the 2000s, I think 2008 or something like that, before he passed in 13. They respect music as a whole. I mean, on one of these albums, I can't remember which one. I think it is. I think it's on Load. I think Mama Said is a country song, effectively. I mean, I know you're like, oh, this is metal, it's Metallica. But no, I mean, you listen to it, it's a country song. It's a country ballad, even. But it's a damn good song. It's one of my favorite Metallica songs. Not because it's a Metallica song, but because it's a good song. It's like The Elder with Kiss. It was a great album, somewhat. I mean, it could have been probably chopped up and more. Some of the demos that I've heard, they probably could have used those and made a real rock album with it. But it's not a good Kiss album for that time. They needed something big. And what was going on in the 90s was, weird. It was new, and people were changing their minds about music and how it was supposed to be presented to them, with Nirvana and the Seattle movement, Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. So I think you saw everybody kind of do that. Metallica they cut their hair, they're wearing jeans and t-shirts, which they already were, but they're not like all. They don't look like the Ramones. They're not all wearing like a black t-shirt and jeans. They kind of have their own flair, do their own thing. Everybody has their own individual styles and stuff. And I mean, look at the cover of Carnival of Souls. They're just in plain clothes, like just typical 90s era clothes, playing music because that's what they love to do. And once MTV started this whole segment of Unplugged series, Kiss was one of those bands that did it. Nirvana had a really big one. That was probably one of their biggest releases, was that. Other bands did it too. Pearl Jam did it, SDP did it. Hell, even LL Cool J get in on the mix. But I think for me, it's really cool to see that these people were trying to stay relevant, and after that, how they kind of put the pieces back together. Because Kiss, they're wearing the makeup again and they're doing their thing. But that stuff, I think, got forgotten. And I think Metallica never really got hurt by it, because their fans are just tried and true, like Kiss fans, they love that. They'll tell everybody they hate it and they really want the thrash, but I think they like that stuff too, secretly. But they're still putting out great stuff to today. Same with Motley Crue doing the tour and stuff that they're trying to plan with Def Leppard, minus coronavirus. There's a lot of things could be said about these bands, but these are some of my favorite bands. These are some of my favorite albums, and I have a different perspective. That's why I was talking about it. I really don't care if you agree with me. If you disagree with me, comment below. If you are tired of hearing me ramble, comment below. Whatever you want to say. Comments are free. You can do whatever you can say whatever you want on here. It's a free message board. But that's pretty much what I have to say about the hair bands to the grunge era. And thanks for listening. Hugh Cheffner, your host here, saying rock on, and I'll see you next time.